Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order. Agreed. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction options. Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Ready and waiting. Very well. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Construction options. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Report. Acknowledged. Report. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative. Awaiting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Comrade. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Construction options. Building. Building. Construction complete. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Vehicle report. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Construction options. Building. On hold. Cancelled. Building. Unit ready.
Yes,
Building.
affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Reporting.
ready.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Building. Unit ready. Building.
Awaiting orders.
Construction complete. Construction options.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Structure sold.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Vehicle affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Waiting order.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction
Acknowledged.
complete.
Acknowledged.
Construction options.
Comrade.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Comrade.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Construction options. Building. Spy plane ready. Select target.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Comrade.
Affirmative. Report. Acknowledged. Reporting. Vehicle report.
Unit
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Building. On hold. Cancel. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged.
Spy
Affirmative.
plane ready.
Affirmative.
Select target.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative.
On hold. Cancel.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Comrade, affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Insufficient funds.
Waiting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Spy plane
Affirmative.
ready.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Our base is
Affirmative.
under attack.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Reporting.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit lost. Structure sold. Construction complete. Building. Prepared. Construction complete. Unit ready. Building. Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Yes, sir.
prepared.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Vehicle affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Waiting for
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Reporting.
Unit lost.
At once.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Building. Insufficient funds. Construction complete.
Waiting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Our base is under attack. Building.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Vehicle acknowledged. Reporting. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Construction complete. Repaired. Unit repaired. preparing.
Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared. Preparing. Unit prepared. Prepared.
Waiting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit prepared.
Affirmative.
Select target. Preparing.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Building.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared.
Waiting order. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Report acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Awaiting order. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Spy plane ready. Select target. Reinforcements have arrived. Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Select target. Building.
Report affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Affirmative.
Building. Preparing.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Very well. At once. Very well. Yes, sir.
Comrade.
Unit
Awaiting
ready.
for
Unit
acknowledged.
prepared. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting order. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Awaiting.
Spy plane ready.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Awaiting
ready.
orders. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
On hold. Cancel.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Select target.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Acknowledged.
Building. Construction complete.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge.
Spy plane ready.
Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Reporting. Yes, sir.
lost.
Affirmative. Very
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
At once.
Unit ready.
Agreed. Very well.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Report.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Yes, sir. Agreed. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
At
Building.
once. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Ready and waiting.
lost.
Very well.
Unit
Acknowledge.
lost.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Insufficient funds.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost. Unit lost.
Reporting. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Select target.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Building. Construction complete. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Waiting order. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Select target. Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Awaiting orders. Agreed. Yes, sir. Very well. Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Spy plane ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building. Select target.
Yes, sir. Comrade.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit ready. Building. Prepared.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared.
Awaiting orders.
Unit ready. Prepared. Select target. Reinforcements have arrived.
Awaiting orders.
Building.
Report
Unit
affirmative.
prepared.
Affirmative. At once. Very well. Of course.
Prepared.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Very well. Report affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared. Spy plane ready.
Reporting. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building. Select target. Our base is under attack. Unit ready. Building. Construction complete.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Affirmative. Waiting for
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Comrade.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Select target.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Comrade. Affirmative.
Ready and waiting. Yes, sir.
Our base is under
Acknowledged.
attack.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Waiting for acknowledged.
Building.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Cannot deploy here.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Yes, acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Spy plane
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes,
Unit
affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
At once.
lost.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Waiting
lost.
orders. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
At once.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Agreed. Reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Select target. Our base is under attack. Select target. Reinforcements have arrived.
Reporting. Very well. Agreed. Agreed. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative. Waiting or affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. At once.
Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Report agreed. At once. Yes, sir. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. Very well.
Building. Construction complete. Building. Construction complete. Spike lane ready. Select target. Primary building selected. Building. Unit ready. Building. Unit ready.
Ready and waiting.
Unit lost. Unit lost. Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Reporting.
Building. On hold. Primary building selected. Building. Unit ready.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged.
Spy plane ready.
Acknowledged.
Primary building selected. Building. Unit ready.
Reporting. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Select target. Reinforcements have
Reporting.
arrived.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Ready and affirmative. Waiting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order. Reporting. Agreed. At once. Agreed. At once. Agreed. At once.
Building.
Waiting order.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready. Building.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Spy plane ready. Select target. Insufficient funds. Unit ready.
Comrade, affirmative. Waiting order. Agreed. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Waiting orders at once.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting orders at once. Affirmative. Very well.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Yes, sir.
Spy
Yes, sir.
plane ready.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Select target.
Vehicle report.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Comrade. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative.
Our base is under attack. Spy plane ready. Building. Construction complete. Building. Select target.
Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Agreed.
Reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Spy plane ready. Select target.
Report. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Select target. Reinforcements have arrived.
Waiting orders. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Agreed. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Spy plane
Acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Agreed. Waiting order.
Acknowledged.
Select target.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Comrade, affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Unit
Comrade,
ready.
affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Ready and waiting. Very well. Comrade?
Building.
Yes,
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledged. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Spy plane ready.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Agreed. Agreed.
Report. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Select target.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. At once. Yes, sir. Reporting. At once. Agreed. Of course. Comrade.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Waiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Building. Insufficient funds.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative. Of course.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Spy plane ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Select target.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Comrade. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Spy plane ready. Select target.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Spy plane ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building. Select target. Unit ready. Building.
Comrade,
Unit
acknowledged.
ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Insufficient funds. Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. At once.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Spy plane
Yes,
ready.
sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Select target.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting.
Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Acknowledged.
Mission accomplished.